She was forced to serve as a maid at her sister's wedding, but the one who said "I do" to the prince at the altar was her. Before dawn, the palace breathed in whispers and damp stone. The corridors behind the gilded rooms were awake before the sun, alive with the soft industry that made splendor look effortless. Isabel moved among the shadows with a work basket on her arm. Her thumb smarted where a pin had caught it. The sting helped her keep steady. She knelt beside a wedding gown spread over a trestle table in a narrow anteroom. The silk was pale as a sigh, the hem heavy with embroidery. She set each stitch with care, counting as she went. A draft slipped along the floor and licked the candle. The flame dipped, then straightened. Beyond the door, a violin tested a phrase and stopped. A man's cane tapped twice, as if the time itself needed correction. Her name was never spoken in these corridors, unless a correction followed it. That made the rhythm familiar. Do this. Not like that. Again. Isabel obeyed without pause and felt the old ache rise and settle. She had learned to lift her chin only when no one watched. A maid passed with a bundle of linen and paused to watch the needle flash through silk. "It will show if you hurry," the girl murmured, half envy, half warning. "It will show if I don't," Isabel said, and eased the seam smooth with her thumb. She heard how the words sounded, low even, impertinent to ears sharpened for affront. She kept her gaze on the thread, as if care could make her invisible. Footsteps, firmer now. An order to deliver orange blossoms to the chapel. A reminder that the Hall of Mirrors must be checked for smudges from careless hands. A summons to bring water for the bride's breakfast, and to mind the train so it did not touch the floor. Isabel rose, gathered her basket, and felt the pull in her shoulders that came from bending over beauty that belonged to someone else. She crossed toward the chapel by a service stair. The orangery was waking in mist, its glass panes holding back the cold. Gardeners unbarred the doors with the thud of bolts. Orange leaves gave their bitter perfume when the air moved against them. Isabel set down her basket beside a wreath half woven. The priest's assistant gestured, and she lifted the wreath, the scent rising to her cheek. "Careful," he said without looking, as if care were a thing one could pour from a jug. She did not answer. A bell rang twice. The sound went up through the bones of the palace and down again. Time gathered itself and pushed her toward the Hall of Mirrors. She knew the official route through those rooms. She had been made to learn the back route. Polished parquet, tall windows holding blue early light. No one to look at the servants unless there was a chance to scold. She entered by the far door and moved along the edge, keeping to the line where her dark skirt did not reflect. The mirrors doubled the day. Her own face passed her twice, then was gone. He stepped out from an adjoining gallery at the same moment she turned. The tray in her hand slid an inch. He reached to steady it without touching her fingers at first, and then they did meet, a brush of skin on skin that neither of them had intended. Reflex gave the contact meaning. It felt like a spark struck from steel because there was no room in this place for accident. "Forgive me," he said, and the apology came with a small inclination that admitted fault without losing distance. "It would have been the oranges on the floor, not your dignity," she said. The words were soft, but the cadence carried a dry edge. She wished them back as soon as they were born on air. The prince's mouth almost softened. That was all. Almost. His profile held the practiced angles of courtesy. A page hesitated at the door, uncertain whether to interrupt. Isabel corrected the tray with a practiced tilt and took a step sideways. "Do you work for the household?" he asked. Formal, neutral. The kind of question that could pass as no question at all. "I was told I do," she answered. "So I do." The page regained courage and crossed the room, the heel of his shoe marking rhythm on the floor. The prince gave a single nod that had weight in it. The moment closed. She felt it fall like a curtain. It left a small echo behind, and echoes were dangerous in a house of mirrors. Near midday the air warmed. Bees blundered against the orangery glass and found their way out again. The chapel rehearsal unfurled in its measured way. Steps counted, responses timed, crossings practiced, until they looked unpracticed. Isabel carried a ewer from one alcove to another and set it down under a window where the light bent over it. She felt, rather than saw, the glance that caught on her. It slid away. The Duchesse de Montjoie stood in the nave with her fan folded, a general dressed as a rule. "Stand aside," the Duchess said without raising her voice. Isabel stepped back an exact pace. "Lower," the Duchess added, and Isabel lowered her chin the fraction required. The point was to show who made the correction. The rehearsal swelled and fell around them. Celeste, laced into pale silk, moved as she had been taught to move. She was beautiful the way a lily is beautiful, whiteness, curve, a little fragile at the edge. When she lifted her hands, the lace trembled. Isabel watched her sister's fingers shake and made her own still by force. "Do not clutter the aisle," the Duchess went on, the fan flicking open and closed, a weapon disguised as manners. "And do not answer when you are not asked." Isabel received it like rain. If she had been younger, the rebuke would have washed her away. She was not young. She was also not old enough to be immune. The prince stood near the chancel rail and heard, or chose not to hear, the exchange. His attention moved from Celeste to the placement of flowers to the shadows in the corners where dust might gather by nightfall. It kept returning, against sense, to a shape at the edge of his sight in a dark dress. He put his hands behind his back and locked his fingers to keep them still. He had crossed thousands of rooms. This room had the trick of using every mirror to invite thought. He had learned to refuse that invitation. He measured the distance down the center aisle, where he would walk tomorrow. He counted the steps, because numbers held when faces blurred. The officiant murmured a reminder. The master of ceremonies cleared his throat. The line of motion carried, broke, resumed. He noted Celeste's smile. It was perfect and a little glazed. Her mother stood behind her shoulder, a light touch only when someone looked. When no one did, the grip darkened the silk with the pressure of a palm. He put those small things away in order, like letters in a neat stack. He watched a servant girl carry a wreath to the altar and almost trip on a ripple in the carpet. The girl corrected herself without losing a petal. He watched the same girl turn away from the Duchess and keep her head lowered half a heartbeat too long, which said more than any speech. He understood expressions far better than he was given credit for. His reputation insisted on inscrutability. It cost him something to keep it up. He did not look at the girl again. The mind does what it will in spite of instruction. He thought about her once more, and then made himself think instead of the weight of a crown he did not yet wear but was expected to carry in every gesture. By afternoon the palace heat had thickened with candle smoke and expectation. Isabel carried cups into a family parlor she had entered all her life with permission, and now only with a tray. She moved quiet as a thought and set the porcelain down without clink. The Marquise paused in speech to pretend a smile at her, then resumed more softly with the man in the doorway. Isabel did not look twice. Her body wanted to listen even when her mind knew it should not. "Debts that breathe grow teeth," the man said. Comte du Verger. His tone never rose. It did not need to. "One gesture at the altar, and I become generous. One hesitation, and the whole court becomes learned in your books." "My daughter is not a ledger," the Marquise answered. Isabel felt the room hold its breath for the end of the sentence. "But she will repair one." "You say the right words," he said. "The king likes right words. I like papers that do what words cannot." Isabel moved the tray the space of a saucer and felt the pull in her shoulders again. She thought of her father without meaning to. She thought of the sound his pen made when he wrote at his desk after dinner, the scratch carrying along the hallway like a grasshopper's song. The memory was a door she had not opened. The Marquise's smile lifted. It had weight. "You forget yourself, Comte. I keep my house in order. Not as tidy as you imagine. he said. His fingers traced a small rectangle in the air, then disappeared into his cuff. Midnight comes even to Versailles. Isabel left before her presence could be noted as a trespass and turned down a narrow passage lined with cupboards. The air cooled. The sound of strings from the rehearsal dulled to a hum you felt more than heard. She came to the office that had been her father's. It had been converted to a space no one used if they could help it. She stood a moment at the door, letting the weight of the place settle. Dust lay on the writing table, a fine film that caught light. She crossed to it and ran a knuckle along the edge where her father had done the same when he was thinking. The gesture found the loosened molding she had worried with childish fingers once and been scolded for. The panel shifted the width of a fingernail. She slid it back. Paper waited in the darkness behind. One folded sheet, ribbon tied, sealed. The seal had not been broken. She did not touch the wax at first. She laid her hand on the paper to feel if the old warmth of hands lingered against superstition. The orange blossom scent came up faint and shocking. She had known it since she had a lap to climb into. She held her breath and broke the seal cleanly. Her father's hand filled the page with those precise flourishes he had loved. She moved her lips as she read, a habit she had never lost when the words mattered more than her pride. The language was clear. The proposed marriage agreement named his legitimate eldest daughter, Isabel, as party to the contract upon which relations would be reinforced. Witnesses, date, countersignature. She felt the line of her life tilt. She stood very still, then sat down because the legs under her had remembered the last time her father's pen had scratched across paper. It was not grief that took her. Grief had already had its turn. It was anger that came quiet. The sort of anger that made decisions rather than scenes. She bound the sheet again in the narrow blue ribbon. Her fingers knew what to do. She lifted the laces at her bodice the necessary inch and slid the folded paper flat against her stays. The ribbon she tied at her wrist as if it were a thread to lead her back, should the corridors become a labyrinth too thick to bear. She smoothed her skirt and put her hand on the table once to steady herself. She left the room as if it had always been empty. Outside, evening crept in. The palace warmed with company. Footmen struck flint and lit candles with swift bows. The hall of mirrors woke to itself. Every flame doubled and then doubled again, glass throwing the room into feverish light. Isabel took a route that would let her pass the chapel one more time to look at the flowers and make sure the orange blossoms had not wilted at the edges. She needed the small control of that. In the chapel's side aisle, she checked the wreath, lifted one petal with the back of a nail, and replaced it with a steadiness that felt borrowed. She did not look toward the chancel. She looked at her hands and thought of the ink strokes on the page against her skin. The narrow ribbon pressed her pulse. It was inarguable. It was also a war waiting to happen. She walked back toward the family wing. The corridor into which it opened had seemed hospitable all her life by habit. Now it looked like what it was, a threshold fenced with rules. She held her work basket on her arm because it gave her a reason to be anywhere. She took 3 more steps and stopped. The Marquise stood in the doorway to the family rooms. Her dress was the color of ripe wheat. Her smile was harvest sunlight turned into a blade. The key ring in her hand flashed once, a row of small moons. "You may sleep in the servants' quarters tonight," the Marquise said. Her voice could have been water, cold and clear. "We require quiet." Isabel measured the distance between them. She found herself counting the keys and felt foolish for doing it. "My pallet is here," she said. "I am to be called before dawn." "Then you will be woken," the Marquise answered. She moved her hand as if she had all the time in the world to enjoy the weight of the keys. "You have a gift for being where you are not needed." Isabel did not look at the hand. She looked at the woman's mouth. It had the same shape as Celeste's, softened by powder and the years it had learned to carry. "I have a gift for doing what must be done," Isabel said. "Leave the tray," the Marquise said, as if the object were the problem, "and go." There were 1,000 possible speeches that would have made no difference. Isabel's body knew the old path of obedience. Her fingers loosened. The basket carried its own small weight, absurd and ordinary. She set it on a stool beside the door. The metal of the keys looked clean enough to cut. A door further down the corridor clicked. The sound of laughter from an inner room made the corridor feel narrower. Isabel kept her shoulders square. "I will be ready in the morning," she said. She heard the bend in the words and let it stand. She turned to go. The Marquise's hand touched the keys to the lock and slid them free of the ring. The bolt lifted. The door opened the width of her body. Her other hand reached out with a swiftness that would always surprise people who thought grace meant slowness. She took Isabel's own small ring of keys from her hand with a pressure that was almost a caress. The gesture was clean, practiced, final. "You have no business here tonight," the Marquise murmured. The words were almost tender. "Do not test me." "You taught me how to do that," Isabel said, and heard herself say it, and wondered if she was as tired as she felt. The door closed with a soft authority that no shout could match. The bolt went across in a sound that carried down the corridor like a warning. Isabel looked at the wood's grain as if it could teach her how to be silent. She lifted her hand to find the keys and found only air. Her palm remembered their shape without finding it. Behind the door, quiet voices arranged futures as if placing plates. In the corridor, air cooled as the east doors were opened to let night in. Isabel stood where she had been left because moving would have been the same as retreat, and she could not tolerate that word. Not now. The blue ribbon at her wrist seemed brighter in the candlelight. It pulsed where her pulse did. A shoe scraped at the far end of the passage. Not careless, familiar. Brisk steps found a rhythm that said rank more clearly than a crest. Isabel turned her head just enough to see the approaching figure in silhouette, the fan already in motion like a drawn sword, and she knew it was the Duchess. The fan cut the air like a thin blade. The Duchesse de Montjoie advanced with 3 precise steps and stopped just inside Isabel's breath. Powder drifted from her towering hair when she tilted her head. "You obstruct," she said, dry as salt. "And after I have advised you twice today." Isabel let her gaze fall, not as surrender, but to show that she understood the rules. "I was turned out of the family wing," she said. "I sought instruction." "You have it," the Duchess replied. "Scrub the service stair to the orangerie. Polish the rails until my reflection can read a psalm upon them. Then present yourself to the chapel to collect wax strips. You will not be seen from the grand corridor until dawn." A maid behind the Duchess flicked her eyes toward the closed door, as if to say, "Run." Isabel did not move. "Yes, madame." The fan snapped shut with a sound like a verdict. "And keep your head low. Pride is a poor veil." Isabel nodded. It cost her less than words. She went down into stone. The service stair smelled of damp and lye. A pail waited where it always waited. She took the brush and the bucket without a sigh. Kneeling, she worked the bristles into grooves worn by a century of feet. The cold bit her knees, then went numb. Water darkened the steps in clean arcs, and the sound of scrubbing filled the space where other thoughts would have gone. When her back protested, she switched hands. She counted strokes because numbers were loyal when people were not. A bell marked the hour. Far above, the palace's public face wore music and soft voices. Down here, only the breath of the place moved, a draft that teased the candle flame until it leaned like a listener. Isabel shifted to the rail and polished the iron until it shone, watching her own thin reflection bend and straighten with the metal. The blue ribbon at her wrist caught a bead of water and darkened to azure, then lightened again. She touched it, check, and returned to the work. By the second bell, the rails would already pass the Duchess's test. Isabel kept at them until the skin on her palm felt tender and clean. Then she rose, lifted the bucket, and went up again. The chapel's side aisle was empty, except for a chapel boy dozing on a stool and a scatter of wax halos where candles had bled in rehearsal. Isabel set her brush aside and used the knife from her basket to lift each circle with care. She moved slowly along the wood, gathering evidence of yesterday into a ball that would be melted and poured new. The work had a stubborn dignity she liked. Things could be asked to hold, and they held. "Did you wake him? Or is he practicing?" a voice asked from the shadow of a pillar. Isabel did not turn her head. "He sleeps like the righteous," she said, "or like a child who has been told he is righteous." The priest's assistant half smiled. "Leave the drips at the sacristy, and carry this cloth back to the candlesticks when you return. It keeps the wax from doing what wax does." He placed a folded square of linen on the rail. She slid it into her skirt pocket. "As you like," she said. "As the Duchess likes," he corrected, and moved on. When the wax was done and the cloth in place beneath the 2 tall candles by the chancel, she set herself to sweeping the side chapel. She worked without looking too long toward the main aisle where the altar stood in careful innocence. Even empty, it felt crowded with attention. The hour edged forward. Sounds altered as the kitchens sent out their first trays. A faint breath of coffee and chocolate sneaked under doors. A footman's whisper tugged a reply at it like thread returning to needle. Isabel took her broom and pail back through the service corridors as the palace began to stir on the splendid side. She felt the weight at her chest as a separate pulse. Inside the stays, flat against her, the folded paper warmed to the heat of her skin. When she passed the entry to the family wing, she looked once at the latched door and once at the space where her keys had been cut away. She went on. The orangery opened to dawn with a crack of bolts and a sweep of cold air. Glass fogged on the inside, then cleared as the temperature remembered its appointment with the day. Gardeners rolled tubs of orange trees a pace to the left and then a pace to the right, finding the line where light and floor agreed. The leaves shivered as if the trees themselves were waking. The smell reached her even before she stepped in, a clean, bitter sweetness that made promises to mouths and heads alike. "Wreaths," the head gardener said without flourish, pointing to a table where cut blossoms lay like snow fallen in precise drifts. "Carry to the chapel. Do not breathe on them more than you must." She lifted the first, a crown for the altar, and another girl took the second. The petals brushed her knuckle. She thought, absurdly, of the powdered air the court preferred, and the way this scent cut through it like truth. He came down the orangery's center path in a small eddy of attendants. Even at that hour the prince moved with the measured care of someone whose every gesture was recorded by eyes. He paused at the doorway to speak to a gardener, and the men around him altered their distance by a hair's breadth so they would not be mistaken for confidants. He stepped inside, breathed in as if without meaning to, and smiled at the trees. He saw the girl he had nearly collided with in the mirror room. He did not look long. He did not need to. A person becomes an outline first. Then, despite caution, becomes a detail. The line of a wrist. The sound of a voice that did not tremble. The way she saw him as something other than a crown. "Your Highness," the head gardener said, formal without servility. "The light is good here," Adrian said. "It does the trees credit." "The trees like to be praised," the man replied, with the bluntness of someone who tended living things instead of manners. Adrian took that in and turned a fraction to let Isabel pass with her wreath. She did not curtsy. That would have been pretension in a workroom. She dipped her chin the smallest amount that would satisfy the Duchess if she appeared. She did not stop. He moved an inch to accommodate the wicker's path and breathed the scent she carried. His hand almost lifted to steady where no steadiness was needed. "Are you assigned to the chapel?" he asked, because his voice wanted to test its own sound against quiet. "I am assigned where I am told," she said, as if the answer were a sheep that needed penning. Then she added, after one clean heartbeat, "This morning, yes." He considered a safer sentence and let it pass. "The wreath suits the altar." "It suits every head but mine," she said, and he heard the truth under the jest. It touched something in him that had been stiff a long time. A cough from the doorway reminded him he was not alone. He nodded once and made a show of inspecting the leaves, as if he had come to do exactly this and nothing else. "Carry them before the heat thickens," he said to the gardener. "They will last longer." "We will," the man replied, "if the hall will let them." Adrian stepped aside. As Isabel passed him, the blue thread at her wrist flashed where light found it. His gaze caught on that brief stroke of color. He said nothing. He knew the value of not naming a thing too soon. He let her go and turned to the attendants, who rustled a little as if relieved to have the scene settle into an ordinary shape again. By full morning, the palace wore its splendor like armor. Courtiers gathered in clots that dissolved when an important hem or title passed near. The Duchesse de Montjoie found Isabel in the nave with a small army of girls and a master of ceremonies pacing in front like a captain. "The step, please," the Duchess said, with a voice that could cut glass. "If you carry flowers, you will not look at the pews. If you carry candles, you will not look at the candles. You will look at the place where you will set them down. The place will look back at you. That is all." Isabel held a bundle of white stems. She pictured the place where they would lie, the square of altar cloth, the edge of marble. She took one slow step, then the next. The mistress's fan snapped open. "Not like that. If you float, you trip. If you march, you break. Do not be yourself. Be a line." A footman snickered and then stopped when the Duchess's head turned. Isabel lowered her lashes and adjusted her pace to the beat the mistress imposed. She would not give them more to enjoy. She felt the pinch of attention on the back of her neck and kept her shoulders quiet. Across the hall, Adrian let his schedule slip a fraction out of his pocket. Paper slid to floor with the softest sigh. The master of ceremonies bent at once to return it. Adrian delayed his hand by the small time it took to breathe in and out. The rehearsal stalled by half a minute, then another, long enough for the worst flutter of the Duchess's temper to dissipate without finding a target to destroy. When the paper returned to him, he accepted it with a look that meant nothing to anyone who did not watch men trained to say one thing and mean another without moving their mouths. After the drill, the mistress dismissed the servants with a flick. Isabel stood with the other girls in a cluster that pretended it did not exist. The hall of mirrors gleamed beyond the chapel's open doors. A steward called for two to carry lilies to the far end, where a placement had changed on the prince's instruction. Isabel volunteered because it let her set her feet somewhere that was not under the Duchess's thumb. They stepped into mirrored light that tried to swallow them. The gallery was nearly empty for a blessed sliver of time. Isabel crossed to the altar table by the far window and set the lilies down. The other girl went to fetch a vase. For a count of 3, Isabel was alone. Adrian had come searching for the reason the lilies had been moved. He arrived at the same moment and stopped when he saw her adjusting the stems so they would not bruise one another. The detail mattered more than it should have. He paused at her shoulder. The glass threw his face back at him from 6 angles. He looked smaller in repetition. He did not enjoy the sensation and held to his own shape by force. "Too many in one vase will drink each other dry," she said without turning. It was not advice. It sounded like it, and it wasn't. He heard it as confession. "How many is enough?" he asked. "As many as can stand without leaning," she said. He thought of alliances that required leaning and did not say so. "Your hand is steady." "It becomes so when watched," she said. "Flattery is a poor brace." "Is that what I offered?" His tone warmed by a degree. "You offered attention," she said. "It can be heavier than flowers." For a moment, silence understood its task and made room. His sleeve brushed her wrist as they both reached to turn a single stem. She drew in a breath that had nothing to do with lilies. He felt the intake as if the air had passed through his own ribs. A cough from a footman at the far door scattered the quiet like birds. The other girl returned with the vase. Adrian repositioned his hands to the posture a prince assumes when he is observed. Isabel shifted half a step back and took up the lilies as if nothing at all had happened that anyone could name. "Your Highness," the steward said brightly.
The minister asks, "I am coming," I replied without impatience. "See that the lilies are not left to wilt in the heat." Of course, he left.
Isabel watched the way he did it, and learned something she had not known, that a man could walk to his duty and still look like himself. The day pressed forward. The Duchess's rules grew teeth. She caught a girl with an open mouth at the edge of the prince's path and bit her with a warning so sharp the child flinched. Isabel kept out of the way and in it at once, where people saw her only when they needed hands. She ran trays. She fetched water. She returned to the orangery for a coil of ivy the minister's wife had decided she required. When she came back through a side hall, she saw two figures in an alcove that was supposed to be empty. Celeste leaned against the stone with her face turned up, the powder at her throat making her look as if she had been carved and then breathed upon. The young guardsman stood too close for propriety and too far for comfort. He looked like men looked when they wanted to do right, and had learned too late that right and happiness had never been introduced. "I cannot breathe," Celeste whispered, and the guardsman's face softened with a terror that had no place in a chapel. "If I go any farther, I fall." "Say the word," he murmured, "and I will vanish. I live to vanish." "I do not want a ghost," she said. "I want a man in a room where my mother is not." A scuff of shoe from the far shadow turned Isabel's head. The Comte du Verger stood in the corridor's throat, not quite seeing and seeing enough. His expression did not change. Something in it did. He did not step forward. He did not leave. He took one smooth breath that said, "I will store this." Isabel knew exactly how many beats of her heart she had to choose. She slid back the way she had come. Her footsteps gave no news. She did not run. She did not intervene. She set the coil of ivy where it would be found and told herself that love was no use if it set two people burning without water in the house. She found the Comte later without intending to. The palace makes circles if you walk it long enough. He was standing by a window where the glass had not been cleaned as perfectly as the Duchess would have liked. The streak blurred the gardens beyond into a watercolor smear. He did not look out. He looked at his reflection. "You see everything," he said, as if it were compliment and indictment in one. "I see what is in front of me," Isabel replied. "And what is hidden," he added. "Some of us are paid to know. Some of us are not. You are not." "Then I must be blind," she said. "You are neither blind nor stupid," he said, lazy and exact, "which makes you dangerous, unless you are wise." "What is wisdom to you, Comte?" She kept her voice even. She had a tray. It was a shield as well as a burden. "To keep the mouth shut until after the priest speaks," he said. "Then mouths may ruin nothing. You serve your family best by serving in silence." "That is not what I have seen," she said. "What have you seen?" he asked, as if he were a man conversing about weather. "A great deal of cleaning," she said, and left him with that. He laughed once, low and unkind. "Do not forget," he said without calling after her. "I do not." Afternoon settled into that heavy hour when everything is waiting and nothing can admit it. The Duchess sent the last of the girls away to rest. Isabel carried a tray to the parlor where the Marquise sat with Celeste beside her like a figure set for display. The mother's hand rested on the daughter's knee. The daughter's face had chosen stillness as safer than any expression. "You may go," the Marquise told Isabel without looking. "Return when the bell rings." Isabel set the tray down and backed out. In the corridor, her feet decided to carry her to the small room where she kept her few things, because the body seeks a corner when weather approaches. She reached her door and hesitated, because habit had taught her to listen before she entered any place that could humiliate her. No sound answered. She lifted the latch. The room was clean in the way of rooms where women have little enough to make a mess. The palette ran along the wall. The small table held a comb and a bit of ribbon. The window was latched against a whisper of rain that had come and gone. The air smelled of lye and the ghost of orange blossom that had clung to her clothes. She set the tray on the floor and exhaled once. the folded square of linen the assistant had given her pressed against her hip in her pocket, a small, orderly weight. That detail calmed her in a way she could not have explained. Her hand went to her bodice as if on its own. She had checked the document a dozen times by touch since she had hidden it. She had not needed to see it. The press of paper against bone had been proof enough that she had not imagined the ink strokes and the seal's hard circle. Her fingers found skin, then stays, then the small heat of her own body. No edge met them, no thickness. Her palm pressed flat and slid, searching. Nothing. She did not gasp. She sat down very slowly on the pallet so she would not fall and look ridiculous even in a room where no one could see. She lifted her left wrist and found the blue ribbon had been cut neatly and retied to appear whole. When she tugged it, one end came away with dishonest ease, and the frayed thread bit her like a rebuke. Someone had been in her room and in her dress, with the calm confidence of a person who knew she would not scream, and the sealed letter was gone. She did not rise at once. The room held her in a stillness that was not peace. A shout would bring the wrong ears. A whisper would be devoured by stone. Isabel pressed her palm once more to her bodice, as if will could make edges reappear. Skin met stays. Heat met bone. No paper. Outside, a trotting laugh broke, then died under a hissed admonition. The palace was a throat swallowing everything it did not wish to hear. Isabel lifted the cut ribbon at her wrist and studied the neatness of the severed end. Not a ragged tear. A tidy theft. The knot had been retied to pass a glance, as if the thief enjoyed small theaters. The folded linen in her pocket nudged her hip. She drew it out. The cloth smelled faintly of wax. When she opened it, she found what she had already found and not yet accepted. A small coil of her blue ribbon and the impression of a signet pressed once into the cloth while the wax had been soft. Not a seal, a hint, a message that said, someone saw, someone knows, someone expects. Her first thought was anger. The second was colder and saved her. Someone returned a token and took the proof. The combination was either cruelty or caution. She counted enemies and found too many. She counted friends and found none she could name aloud. There was a shape that refused to be counted because names had a way of cutting off paths. She folded the linen again and tucked it away. She set her hand flat against the pallet, then pushed herself to her feet. If she could not hold the paper, she would hold to the hour. She had been assigned and turned out, and assigned again. She would finish each task, because simple, finished things were stones in a river that wanted to carry her off. The bell for the quarter hour murmured twice. She picked up her tray. The corridor saw her exit without surprise. She kept to the edge where servants belong and made the small decisions of the morning. She would go to the chapel, where the flowers needed checking. She would keep away from the family wing until called. She would not look like a woman who had lost something she could not afford to lose. The servant door to the chapel stood on its latch. She slipped in on quiet feet. The nave, empty of people, felt full of gaze. Candles waited with their wicks neatly clipped. The altar flowers held their shapes, the petals thick with scent. She checked each lily for bruising and turned one stem to drink better. The action soothed the part of her that could not be soothed. "Here," a voice said softly. "The cloth you placed needs changing." The chaplain, thinner than his robe suggested, held out a folded square of linen. He meant the practical thing, a layer beneath the tall candles to catch wax. She took it with a nod. When her fingers brushed the cloth, a memory sprang up of the linen in her pocket, the signet's ghost. She wondered for a breath if the same hand had touched both pieces. The thought startled her. Not fanciful, useful. "Does the altar need more blossom?" she asked, to sound as she always sounded. "It needs steadiness," he replied, and shrugged one shoulder, as if he were weary of words that refused to do enough. "They will give it ceremony." She replaced the cloth with her head bent. The air there was warmer, nearer the flame. Her skin prickled where sweat thought of rising and did not. Footsteps sounded in the side aisle, measured, surrounded by smaller footsteps that kept time with them. She turned her face away a fraction and finished her task with an attention that was almost a prayer. Adrian entered the chapel and felt the space receive him with a calculation practiced by old buildings and older institutions. The air cooled his lungs. The scent of blossom lifted, then settled again. His counsel had processed him through instructions and cautions as if they could cloak him in them. They had been generous with phrases like, "for the stability of both courts," and sparing with kindness. "We ask only vigilance," one counselor had said, a man whose hair powder never smudged his collar. "We ask what can be asked," another had added. "All else must wait. You must give them no reason to doubt now." He had listened with patience because impatience would be read as arrogance. He had not argued because argument would be read as defiance. He had held still while they hinted at debts and suitability and the usefulness of the Marquise's ambition. He had felt the thrum of his own heart and tamped it down until it matched the measured beat of state. Now he stood where vows would be spoken. Celeste's rehearsal had gone through its paces without incident. He had seen the tremor in her hands and the precision of her mother's touch guiding her arm to stillness. He had seen from the corner of his eye a girl in a dark dress tend to wax, as if wax were an affidavit. He had seen a blue thread at a wrist and a look that did not ask anything from him, except that he be careful with his power. It had felt like a matching. "Your Highness," the chaplain murmured at his side, "we have set the responses here." Adrian nodded. "Thank you." He placed his hand upon the chancel rail because he had been taught to place his hand there. The wood had been polished by centuries of hands. His fingertips warmed to it, then warmed it. The habit of prayer brushed him without presence. He did not ask for favor. He asked for clarity, because clarity had fewer witnesses to disappoint. When he lifted his head again, he saw her across the aisle with the cloth in her hands. She kept her head bowed and her shoulders straight. He understood how deliberate both choices were. He stepped once, twice, so he would pass by and not err by looking like a man who sought out a servant for conversation. "Your hands are steady," he said, as if repeating an earlier compliment in an altered place made it ordinary. "They are, when they must be," she replied. It could have sounded like pride. It sounded like survival. "The Duchess says anyone found within my path without cause will be punished," he said. He did not know why he said it. It seemed useful to put the warning in air where it could be touched. "She has always believed in swift instruction," Isabel said. "I have been warned." "I would not have it," he said. "You do not own it," she answered. "But I thank you for the thought." He kept his tone level. "You look busy?" she offered, and saved them both. It is safer than looking at the altar when one does not belong on it. He carried that away like a shard of glass in his pocket. He walked the length of the nave and told himself to think of steps and timing. His counsel gathered him again before he reached the door, a small cluster of caution that hummed like bees. "Remember the order," one said. "Remember where to look," another advised. "Remember to look nowhere more than once," a third added, with the friendliness of a man who had never been looked at for anything but his usefulness. He left them behind with courtesy. He did not leave behind the sense that something in the arrangement offended not his pride, but his reason. A treaty required precision. He was ready to be precise. He did not know yet what he would have to be exact about. Isabel carried the used cloth to the sacristy, laid it in the correct basket, and returned to the nave with her eyes on the floor. The Duchess stood near the aisle with 3 footmen in neat livery, arranging them as one arranges candles. "You will not block the view of the first row," she said. "You will not align your breath with the prince's step. You will not look at his shoes. You will not look at his face. You will not exist except as hands." One footman swallowed too visibly. The Duchess's fan twitched. "And if any servant is found pausing within the prince's path without cause, I will see them dismissed by sundown." "Dismissed," one repeated, foolishly hopeful. "From service," she clarified. from the palace. Do not make me explain the rest. Isabel bowed her head and let the words slide over her like cold water. Cold kept you awake. She moved along the side aisle where unimportant shadows gathered, and only when she reached the pew she liked because it creaked, betraying spies, did she pause. She slid into the corner, folded her hands, and lowered her forehead to them. It looked like prayer. It was. The sort of prayer one can say in a palace without insulting God. Let what is true hold. She felt, not saw, someone come close. The sensation lifted the skin at the back of her neck. When she lifted her head, he had already moved past, leaving behind on the pew's worn wood a folded square of linen. She did not look right or left. Her fingers covered it, then drew it inside her sleeve. Later would have been safer. Now was the only time she had. Inside the linen lay a coil of blue ribbon tied with a knot that was hers. The wax impression she had seen pressed into the cloth last night had been kissed again by a signet, clean this time. A seal would have been too loud. A signet meant intent without noise. She pressed her thumb to the wax and felt the warmth of recent touch. She could have cried with relief or raged that whoever had done this had done nothing more. She did neither. She breathed, and the breath kept her from breaking. He had known. He had seen. He had returned what he could safely return. He had not brought the paper because the paper would expose him as well as her if discovered between them in a pew. Or, she spent the thought and could not call it back, he had kept it because it mattered more to him in his hand than in hers. Both interpretations fit too well. The uncertainty was a blade that had to be handled carefully, or it would cut what she needed to lift. She ended the prayer with her throat aching and her face cool. Her fingers closed on the ribbon inside her sleeve, as if it were a pulse. She stood. The chapel boy came in with a basket of spare candle stubs and dumped them into a drawer with a clatter. The noise broke something small and brittle in her calm. She welcomed the break. It made room for motion. She left the nave through the side door and fell back into the choreography of the hour. Courtiers arrived in a tide of perfume and murmur. The hall of mirrors filled with silk. The master of ceremonies polished the same spot on the floor with the sole of his shoe, as if he could wear it into agreement. Ushers practiced bows to the empty air, and then to people who chose not to see them. Adrian stood in an antechamber with his council and listened while they said the same careful things in new words. He nodded, because no one had taught him a way to move his head that would make men leave him alone sooner. He thought about the blue thread he had seen flash at a wrist, and the weight of that thought required a straight spine to bear it without showing. The villain accounts, one counselor began, and Adrien held up a hand. After, he said, as one says, not before witnesses. He met each gaze once, and did not look away first. Now we proceed. He crossed into the chapel's side entrance by the path designated for him. The sound hit him as a wall, then softened as the structure shaped it. The first rows were a garden of judgments. He bowed to none of them. He bowed to the idea of a promise, which was the only thing in the room he had chosen for himself. Celeste stood at the far end of the aisle with her mother behind her. For a moment, her face turned from porcelain to human. He saw a girl, and then she became a symbol again because the Marquise's hand found her elbow and adjusted it. He felt an odd pity, as if he were looking at a bird whose wing had been bound to save it from flying. Isabel slipped into rank with the girls who would reappear and disappear like ghosted commas in the sentence of the ceremony. The Duchesse moved them with her fan. Isabel kept to the shadow line where she could see without being seen. She let her body be a piece of the hall's furniture. Her mind did not obey. The Comte Duverger sat where a rising man could be seen by every eye that mattered. His shoulders held that loose confidence men wore when they believed their worst options had been made impossible by other people's fear. He turned his head once to look down the side aisle. It was not a glance. It was a pin through paper. The music began as if lifted into place by unseen hands. The priest stood in garments that made him look larger than his bones. The master of ceremonies lifted his hand and dropped it, and the motion drew people into their marks like thread through fabric. Adrian walked. His foot struck the aisle at the second bar, not because he had planned to, but because bodies seek rhythm. He saw the back of the guardsman's head in the far aisle, held too straight for comfort. He saw Celeste's lashes tremble, then steel. He saw the Marquise's mouth a shade too tight. He took his place and turned to face the priest and the altar. He heard his own breath and set it to a pace that was neither hurried nor slow. The priest spoke the first words of a vow that had been spoken so many times it had its own breath. Adrian answered as he had been taught to answer, clearly, with a warmth that looked like affection to an audience that needed to be fed meaning. He thought of the signet in wax, the coil of blue, and a pair of hands that did not shake when they worked. Celeste approached down the aisle with a veil so fine it caught light like mist. The master of ceremonies smiled a fraction because the veil behaved. The duchess's fan stilled. The hall watched. The world drew itself to a point and balanced. Isabel stood at the column's edge. Her palm lay open inside her sleeve, the ribbon's knot pressing her skin. Her mind held the contract's words, letter by letter, as if memory itself could stand in court. Her heart was not moving faster than the rest of her. It had chosen an even pace because panic would betray her, and she had too much to hide. The question came that would pull the vows into place. The pause that followed was a living thing. Celeste swayed. A murmur rose and was strangled by propriety before it could become sound. Across the far aisle, the guardsman's jaw tightened as if he were clenching it to keep from making a noise that would end his life. Duverger shifted his weight to stand. He would speak that simple word that kills, objection, and dress it in courtesy. The vision of it, like a stain spreading, crossed Isabel's mind, and in crossing, changed nothing and everything. She stepped forward. The motion cleared air in front of her. It drew eyes the way movement in a quiet field draws every bird watching for hawks. The master of ceremonies reached out and missed, because he had never been trained to catch a woman who did not intend to be caught. Isabel walked to the first step of the altar and stopped where candles made small, warm suns along the rail. She did not look at the Marquise. She did not look at the Duchesse. She looked at the priest, and then at the man beside him whose mouth had formed words 1,000 times and would never form this again in exactly the same way. She lifted her head until her throat stretched and her voice could pass through it clean. "I am Isabelle de Villon," she said. "I am the eldest daughter named in the contract upon which this marriage stands." Adrian turned toward her. The hall became a single held breath. Isabel felt the ribbon at her wrist pulse once, then again, like a second heart. She matched the priest's cadence and said the words that could not be unsaid. Silence held like blown glass. No one dared breathe too near it. The priest's mouth was still shaped around the next word when Adrian turned his hand and closed it over Isabel's where it rested, steady as a blade, upon the rail. "Come," he said, and the word had two meanings. "Follow me, and let no one lay hands on you." The master of ceremonies tried to interpose a ritual where there could be none. The Duchess lifted her fan to carve order from scandal. Adrian looked at neither. He moved with Isabel beside him into the sacristy, the small room behind the altar where vestments hung in a neat, holy row. The doors closed. The sound of the court was muted by stone. He did not release her hand until he felt the tremor she was hiding and had to convince his own palm to behave. Her pulse touched his and did something to him that counsel had warned him against all morning. It took precedence over every other beat. His counsel arrived in a gust of powder and indignation. The minister with the king's authority slid in on the calm step of a man practiced in fires. The Marquise entered without looking at her eldest daughter. The comte drifted to a shadow, careful to be present without appearing to author anything. The priest stood, robbed of role and clinging to vestment. "Highness," the minister began, voice smooth. You will forgive me if I skip the preliminaries. We must contain. We must know, Adrian said. He kept his tone level. Lady Isabel claims right by contract. Claims, the Marquise echoed with a laugh that pinned butterflies. My eldest child enjoys dramatics. The younger is ready to fulfill her duty. The nation will not be imperiled by a scene. Isabel faced her mother as if she were facing weather. The contract names me. The seal was my father's. The countersignature is upon it. Produce it, the minister said, not unkindly. It has been stolen, Isabel answered. She made no apology for the void. Last night, the ribbon that bound it was returned to me marked with a signet. The paper is gone. Convenient, the Duchess murmured behind her fan. Adrian moved before the word could bruise further. He unfastened the ceremonial sash from his shoulder and set it across Isabel's with a deliberate care that could not be mistaken. No one will touch her, he said, and that was a command, not a plea. His council looked at one another, as if the floor had shifted under their tidy shoes. The minister's gaze sharpened, then softened by a fraction. The priest made a small sound, approval or fear, it was hard to tell. The Marquise smiled wider. Drama, she said again, and produced a folded paper from a silk bag. There is an addendum. It bears the proper witnesses. It was executed when it became clear the eldest would not suit. Adrian did not look at Isabel then. He took the paper and read the first lines. He knew the late Marquise's hand the way a careful man knows a friend's gait seen across a square. He recognized similar flourishes, similar phrases. He also saw the ink at the edges bleed a little too quickly into the paper, the lines of a hand that tried and failed to copy a habit older than itself. He passed the sheet to the minister without comment. Where did this come from? The minister asked. My writing desk, the Marquise replied. I keep my house in order. And yet your eldest was barred from your wing last night, Adrian said, mild as rain. The Marquise did not flinch. We value quiet in times of state. The Comte's eyes were half-lidded. He admired the ceiling, as if it had acquired a flaw. This is tedium, he said softly, to no one and everyone. The treaty awaits. Adrian ignored him, which cost him nothing. Lady Isabel, he said, and softened his voice more than he meant to. Tell them. She did. Not the color of her anger or the depth of her humiliation. Not the moment the orange blossom rose from the paper like a ghost and made her throat close. She gave the facts with the cadence of a witness. The hidden compartment. The seal unbroken. The wording naming the eldest. The countersignature. The theft in the night. The returned ribbon. The signet's impression. She did not say whose signet it was. She did not know for certain. The minister watched her face for tremors and found none that were not human. The Duchess lifted her fan to her lips as if to hide what might pass there for compassion. She regained severity at once. We cannot admit a contract we cannot see, nor admit an addendum that cannot bear scrutiny, Adrian said, and handed the sheet back to the minister. Look at the witnesses, dates. Elsewhere, those men were elsewhere that season. The minister's mouth twitched. I will examine. Not at leisure, the Marquise said, perfectly cordial. We must avoid a scene. We have a scene, the minister replied, as gentle as a hammer wrapped in velvet. We may yet choose to avoid a calamity. He set the forged-looking paper on the table and weighed it with 2 fingers, as if gauging its truth by touch. He looked at Adrian. Highness, until we have a primary document we can authenticate, we must consider form. There is an irregularity. An annulment will restore our line to the proper path. It need not bruise reputations further. The young lady may be removed from court without noise. The younger may be married at a later hour. Treaties endure. Adrien heard several things at once. The council's relief at a path they understood. The priest's discomfort. The Duchess's satisfaction at a problem framed as etiquette. The Marquise's pulse of triumph under her painted calm. He also heard Isabel's breath steady in, steady out. An annulment, he said, making the word taste terrible. On the grounds of what? The irregularity of a vow spoken without proper consent of parties, the minister said, as if reciting a recipe. You have my consent, Adrian said. Consent ill-timed, the Duchess added. Consent under duress of spectacle? Consent under clarity, Isabel said. Her voice was quiet. I spoke because truth was about to be strangled. The Marquise turned to her as if to a child whose misbehavior was less troublesome than the audience witnessing it. You have embarrassed your sister. I have saved her, Isabel said, and then said no more, because more would be the enemy. Adrienne looked at the annulment papers when they appeared, as if by conjuring. Protocol made paper move as swiftly as rumor. The words were blank lines with futures attached. He could sign and move the pieces into neat positions. He could refuse and turn the ceremony into war. He thought of his principality, which could not afford a breach with France. He thought of Celeste's hand, trembling. He thought of a blue ribbon pressing warm against a wrist that had not been taught to tremble. I will sign, he said at last. If, the minister repeated. If it spares her name, he said. He did not look at the Marquise when he said her. He looked at Isabel. If it spares her exile from any place except this court. If it spares her sister from being made a tool again to pay a debt. The Marquise laughed gently. How moving, how impractical. The minister's brows rose a degree. We can control narrative, he said. We can control little else. Adrian took the quill. Ink gathered at its tip like a held breath. He could choose safety and call it honor. He could choose honor and call it madness. He could choose a path between, which would please no one and satisfy only his conscience. He asked himself a question he had asked all morning. Who am I if I am not useful? Do not sign, Isabel said. He looked up because the voice had not asked anything of him since she spoke at the altar. It did not ask now. It gave instruction without presumption. He waited. They will ruin you to save a story, she said, quiet. They will require your signature to do it. They will say it spares me and spares her. It spares no one. Let me leave. Let them have their neatness. Keep your own blood clean. The Duchess made a sound like a smile tearing. She seeks exile. She seeks peace, Isabel said. You will go where? The Marquise asked, feigning curiosity and failing. To what shelter? To whom? For a girl who insists upon her name, you have remarkably few letters to place after it. I have my father's, Isabel said. It is enough. Adrian put the quill down. The silence changed key. The minister looked at Isabel as one might look at a candle that refused to gutter in a wind. You propose, he said, and neither mocked nor comforted, to be removed at dawn with a paper prepared that will frame your interruption as a mistake of grief. I propose it, she said, because it will harm fewer people than any other course you will tolerate. Adrian's jaw ached. He had been clenching it, unaware. He eased it open. What of truth? He asked her. It is not lost, she said. It is hidden. Truth can survive a day. I cannot strip you to it because men with ledgers will not watch a man they need be stripped. The Comte's smile made no sound but tried to. Sensible, he breathed, for a girl. Adrian's glance cut there like a cold blade. You will find, he said without a rise in his tone, that I am not inclined to be taught sense by men who gamble with other people's lives. Highness, the minister said, a hand of warning lifted. We have chosen a path. Do not salt it. Salt cures rot, Adrian replied. And then let the sentence die, because he could not afford to plant it where it would be harvested at his expense. The minister turned to a clerk who had appeared as quietly as a thought. Prepare carriages at dawn, draft the necessary notice, phrase it as miscommunication and sudden indisposition. No colors, no blame. He paused. And bring a fresh copy of the annulment, Blank signatures. We will hold until morning." The Duchesse nodded once, triumphant in the way of a woman whose rules had bent events without seeming to touch them. The Marquise fixed her shawl with fingers that were too steady. The Comte angled his head to see Isabelle without appearing to. The priest clasped his hands with a relief that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with being spared the task of inventing a new liturgy in public. Adrian lifted the sash from Isabelle's shoulders and folded it once before setting it aside. "I will see you to your room," he said, and then did not move, because if he moved, he might do something that would rearrange the court like furniture thrown from a window. "If you allow me." Isabelle looked at the sash as one looks at a flag rescued from weather. "You have already done more than anyone else in this room," she said. "Do not do more for me and lose what you will need for your people." "Do not tell me what I need," he said, but softly. "I will take my own counsel," she said, not to wound, but because she had learned that the only counsel a woman can be sure of is the one she gives herself. He bowed, because there was nothing left in the house of gestures that would express what he felt without knocking down a wall. "Then I will not sign until morning," he said. "Words bred in haste have poor bones." "And poor bones break," she said. "Do not break yours." They parted in a way that would look, to any witness, perfectly proper. The sash lay folded on the chair, the symbol of a protection offered and, for the moment, set aside. Isabelle stepped out of the sacristy past the Duchesse, who moved her fan a fraction and said, without saying it, that the girl had borrowed too much time. Celeste was nowhere to be seen. Her absence had been arranged to look like delicacy. Isabelle accepted that, because refusing it would harm the person she was trying to shield. She crossed into the service corridor, where the heir remembered ordinary life. She had been turned out of the family wing. She would not beg for reinstatement. The servants' quarters would do. The bed would be narrow and clean. The door would latch. She would sleep in a room where she would not be robbed again, because she had nothing left to steal that a thief could pocket. She reached her little room and closed the door as one closes a book one cannot finish. She sat on the pallet and let her hands lie on her knees until they understood how to be hands again. The ribbon at her wrist had been retied with a liar's neatness, and she retied it again in her own way, a knot she could trust. She could not pray. She could count. She did. An hour later, a soft knock thudded, once, twice. Isabelle did not answer. The third time, the knock came with a voice she knew from a side aisle and from a convoy of restraint. The young guardsman. "Lady," he said low, "forgive the intrusion." She opened the door a palm's width. He stood with his hat in his hands, eyes fixed on the floorboards as if they were the only mercy he could afford to face. "My lady," he said again. "She asks, she begs." "Do not say it here," Isabelle murmured. "Give." He held out a folded paper sealed in haste with a fleck of wax, the sort that clings to a candle's rim. It smelled of powder and orange blossom and fear. "She wrote," he said. "She asked me to carry it. If I am seen, I will call it a list." Isabelle took the note and did not touch his fingers, in pity for him. "You are brave," she said. "No," he said, a smile breaking and dying in the same breath. "I am foolish, and she makes me grateful for it." "She will be spared this," Isabelle said. "She must be." He swallowed. The sound was a man remaking himself around hope. "God keep you," he said, because he had nothing else weighty enough to offer, and backed away with a bow that was too low for his rank and too high for hers. Isabelle closed the door and listened until the measured steps were lost to the palace's throat. Then she broke the seal with the care of someone who had learned how quickly paper could become air. Celeste's hand was round and earnest. The words were as clean as she could make them. "Forgive me," it began. "I am small, and you are not. I am afraid, and you are brave. I have done nothing worthy of love except to give my heart foolishly where I will be despised for it. Do not carry my ruin. Let me carry my name." Isabelle pressed the paper to her lips, then to her heart, as if she were 13, and had given herself away by letting her face say too much. She folded the note and tied the blue ribbon around it in a firm band, the knot flat as a seal. A token could be as heavy as proof if you treated it with requisite dignity. The hours between decision and dawn were the worst. They were not dramatic. They were patient. The palace quieted around her when the guests were fed, and the scandal was served in whispers that hoped to be kinder than they were. Isabel lay down and numbered the boards on the ceiling. She slept in splinters and woke with her heart already steady. She rose before the sky confessed day. The corridor was cool, the kind of cool that carries a thin seam of damp near the windows. Her shoes made no sound on the stone. She folded Adrian's sash, where she had laid it, and set it on the chair beside the little table, as one might return a borrowed cloak to its hook. She smoothed the silk once. It felt warmer than it should have been. She did not let that mislead her. She put Celeste's note into her pocket with the blue ribbon's knot, facing up like a small blue eye. She checked the latch on her window, the chair, the pallet, as if leaving them tidy would make her absence palatable to a place that had the power to swallow people whole. She set her hand to the door, and for a moment could not lift the latch because her fingers remembered someone else's hand closing around them, matching her pulse, promising nothing and everything with that pressure. She lifted the latch and stepped into the corridor, breathing in a steady rhythm she chose, not one imposed by anyone else. She stepped into the corridor, the air cool and faintly damp. Her breath steadied itself against the stone. Latches whispered open along distant galleries. The day was making its quiet way into Versailles. Isabel drew the door to with care and turned toward the eastern stairs. Rain met her at the servants' door, fine as lace, drawing pale threads down the paving. The orangerie glass wore a fragile fog. She felt the weight of the folded confession against her hip, and the steadier weight of having chosen. She would go to the carriage and be made small enough to pass through rumor without feeding it. A figure detached itself from a column's shadow with the practiced discretion of a man who had learned to be useful without leaving fingerprints. Marcel carried himself like a valet who never lost a button and never lost a game he meant to play. "Forgive the hour," he said, low, and looked past her shoulder to be sure they were unobserved. "I have something that belongs to you." Her hand closed reflexively on the ribbon at her wrist. "If it is what I think it is," she said, "it belongs to France." "Then France can borrow it after you have held it a moment," he replied, and extended a folded sheet bound in narrow blue silk. She did not take it at once. She lifted her eyes to his, and in the quick exchange of recognition that passed between two people who had learned to tread softly, she asked the question he answered without sound. He dipped his head. "The Comte should sleep more and drink less," he murmured, "and never play cards with me when his pockets are weighted with other men's names. I retrieved this under the pretense of saving him from further embarrassment." "You saved him nothing," Isabel said. "And then, because she had been taught to be honest at inopportune times, you saved me." "I delivered a letter," he said. "The saving belongs to others." She took it then, and the seal, her father's, cold and perfect beneath her thumb, made her want to close her eyes just to hold the feeling in the dark where it could not be stolen. She did not. She slipped the paper beneath her cloak against her heart. The blue ribbon brushed her skin with that clean whisper of silk. "Go inside," Marcel said. "The minister is with him. They are ready to call the morning a misunderstanding. Their ink is thirsty. Do not let them drink." She nodded. "You have given me a debt I cannot repay." "You can," he said with a ghost of humor, "by being worthy of it." Isabel moved. The rain slicked the threshold. Her steps found quick purchase on stone she knew too well. She did not run, because running draws eyes, and she had learned to move at the speed of purpose. The side corridor emptied before her as if courtesy had finally remembered her name. Adrian stood with his counsel, the annulment lying on the table like a blade in its sheath. The Duchess's fan was shut and waiting to judge. The Marquise had arranged her silence to look like patience. The Comte's mouth wore a calm that would be ruined by one true word. Highness, the minister said, lifting the quill again. Before the palace shakes itself fully awake, if we move cleanly. We will move, Adrian said, and the door opened, as if the word had pulled it. Marcel entered without rustle. He did not bow as low as a courtier might. He bowed as a man does when the thing he brings is more important than himself. He held out the letter. Adrian felt the hairs along his forearm stir as if he had sensed heat before seeing flame. He crossed the space between them in 2 long strides and took the paper with the caution of a man retrieving a life. The seal pressed its familiar circle into his palm. Orange blossom lifted faintly, as if the wax remembered summer. The Marquise's hand, he said, not to be dramatic, but because speaking it aloud was a test of waking. He broke the seal cleanly and unfolded the sheet. Ink marched across the page with the grace of certainty. The words were those Isabel had spoken without proof. The legitimate eldest daughter, Isabel, named as party to the contract upon which relations would be reinforced. Witnesses, countersignature, the king's minister from the year of its drafting. Adrian read twice, not because he doubted, but because reverence made him slow. The minister reached, then thought better, and waited for the page to be offered into his jurisdiction. Adrian passed it over with fingers that did not tremble. The minister bent his head. His lips formed the names of witnesses silently, a man counting money that belonged to the crown. He lifted his gaze. Genuine, he said. It bears our office's mark. The hand is consistent. The seal is original. The Duchess opened and closed her fan once. The snapping sound failed to cut the moment. The Marquise did not sway. She had not been a woman who fell except when it suited her. The Comte's eyelids lowered the smallest degree, as if he admired a trick well played, though it had been played against him. Adrian turned to Isabel where she stood with her cloak still shedding the lace of rain. He looked at her as if balance could be regained by choosing something other than calculation. You told the truth, he said simply. I remembered it, she answered. Now it can be read by anyone who doubts memory. We are done with the annulment, Adrian said to the minister. We are, the minister replied, and set the hateful paper aside without ceremony. Where? Adrian asked. The Hall of Mirrors, the minister said. It wants a spectacle. We will give it a correction. Isabel felt the floor steady beneath her. The fear that had chosen discipline over panic loosened its hold enough for breath to widen. She touched the blue ribbon on her wrist, and then the second ribbon around the folded confession at her side. Paper could still be taken. Words could still be twisted. But they would have to break seals to do it. They moved together toward the great gallery by the route that would be read as official. Adrian walked at the minister's side. Isabel walked with Marcel 2 paces behind, where servants sometimes stand when their presence is needed but unanointed. It suited her for the length of the corridor. The Hall of Mirrors caught morning and multiplied it. Rain made the windows brilliant with tiny streams. Courtiers who had gathered early to feed on the remains of scandal turned as one. Powdered heads, jeweled ears, faces that lived to witness. The organ in the chapel sent a low, sustained note, as if holding its own breath. Adrian mounted the shallow step near the center. He did not stand on the dais as if he needed height. He stood where the sound would carry, and where light would strike his face and make him visible from every angle. He did not raise a hand for silence. The room went quiet because some men are born to carry quiet with them into noise. Friends, he said, and the word landed like a stone in a restless pool. We put too much weight on paper in this place. It makes cowards of us and liars of those who have the best ink. Today, fortunate for us all, the paper bears truth. He held up the letter. He did not need to. The minister stepped forward and spoke for the crown. This is the contract executed by the late Marquis de Villon in the year named here, the minister said. It bears his seal and ours. It names the eldest daughter, Isabel, as party to the treaty marriage. The addendum presented yesterday is a forgery. Its witnesses could not have witnessed. Its ink reveals haste. The crown recognizes the original instrument and the name upon it. No one clapped. The court was too well trained to applaud something as dull as law. The sound that passed instead was relief mixed with the sharper edge of rearranged gossip. The Duchess lowered her fan halfway, then raised it, as if unsure whether etiquette required horror or gratitude. The Marquise's gaze found Isabel like a thrown knife and stopped a hair before impact. The point hung in air. The Comte inclined his head as if congratulating a chess opponent. Adrian addressed none of them. He let the minister's pronouncement settle like dust. Then he did what no protocol had foreseen. "Yesterday," he said, "I was ready to be guided by a story that had been written for me. I have discovered I prefer the one that is true." He turned, not to the first row, not to the Marquise, not to the chaplain who had waited white-faced like a man deprived of script. He turned to Isabel. The court pivoted with him, and the mirrors made their movement a tide. "Lady Isabel," he said, in a voice that seemed to reduce the distance between them to the width of a hand. "By contract, by counsel, by an accident of history that feels less like accident than fate, you stand before me as the person named. I do not ask for your courage now. You have more than I deserve. I ask for your choice." Her throat worked. In a lifetime of orders, the word ask was an unfamiliar key. She stepped forward, the rain-threaded light finding the damp edge of her cloak and making it glimmer. She could feel the court measuring and then failing to measure. Her hand found the blue ribbon without looking. Her fingers were steady. "I choose to honor what my father wrote," she said, "and to keep my sister from being written over by men who think a ledger can make a heart obedient. I choose what I chose yesterday. I choose again today." The sound that moved through the hall then was human and could not be trained out of anyone. It was not approval. It was the shared exhale of people who have braced for a blow and, for once, do not receive it. The minister nodded once, satisfied. "Then let the register be amended where it strayed," he said to the clerk, who was already at his elbow. "Let it bear the name it should have borne. Let the record show that truth was restored by the testimony of a daughter and the honor of a prince." Adrian took the quill the clerk offered and wrote his name as if it had weight worth feeling. He set it down. He had not noticed until that moment how much easier his shoulders had sat when he stopped acting a part that did not fit him. Celeste appeared at the gallery's edge, shepherded by a woman who had the sense to keep to the curtains. The girl looked half relief, half grief, wholly young. Adrian inclined his head to her with courtesy that was not cheap. He sought the guardsman on the far aisle and found him rigid as ever, every nerve waiting to be struck. Adrian lifted his voice enough to reach him. "You have stood straighter than your luck," he said. "The minister has a small commission in his gift for a man who has served without asking for anything but to be allowed to keep serving. Take it. It will send you where tongues are fewer and time is kinder, and it will bring you back with honor." The guardsman blinked once, twice. He looked as if someone had told him the sun was not a rumor. He bowed as low as his knees would permit, without making a spectacle. "Highness," he said, and nothing more, because more would have broken him. Celeste's hand rose, unthinking, to her throat. The Marquise reached to catch the gesture and missed by an inch. Isabel saw the miss and filed it away with the kindness of a woman who had decided not to remember everything. The Comte shifted his weight, ready to thread himself through the gap dignity leaves when it retreats. The minister turned toward him with that particular mildness only power carries. "Comte du Verger," he said, polite to the point of frost. "The office would appreciate your absence from Versailles while we examine certain ledgers that seem to have moved across your desk without the courtesy of our eyes. You will find the provinces very beautiful in spring." The Comte bowed precisely the degree required to avoid insult, and to send one. "Always a pleasure to comply with the crown," he said, and the pleasure was a knife. He backed away into the reflected forest of himself until the doors received him. The Duchess let her fan droop, then lifted it in a gesture that, in some kinder world, could have been a salute. Order, she said, to no one and everyone, as if naming it might bring it back under her hand. Adrian did not wait for order. He had a better word. He crossed to Isabel. He did not take her hand at once. He stood near enough that the rain light made a small, private halo around them that the mirrors could not swallow. Details mattered. The set of her mouth that refused to tremble, the sheen of damp along her brow, the way her shoulders had learned to carry more than their share and were ready to learn to carry something else. "Choose me now," he said, without crown, without the weight of counsel, without anything but the man who had stood at an altar and wanted to believe in vows for reasons that had nothing to do with maps. She might have teased him to soften the moment. She might have spoken of paper and names. She did not. She said, with the calm of someone who had already lived through the hard part, "I do. Again." He inhaled, as if the air had just remembered how to please him. The hall did not cheer. It was not that sort of place. It held the moment up like a glass at just the right angle to the sun. Isabel drew the blue ribbon from her wrist and put one end into his palm. He lifted his other hand. Between them, with a knot that was firm and small, and clearly made by someone who understood the difference between binding and binding, they tied the ribbon around both their wrists. It was not legal. It was not necessary. It was a vow visible from every mirror. The minister looked at the knot and decided not to see it officially. The priest smiled, relief giving him a better color than powder had. The Duchess's fan stopped moving. The Marquise was very still because movement would have been undignified. Celeste pressed her fingers to her mouth and lowered them again with effort. Rain thickened outside, drawing silver lines down the windows. The oranges in the orangery beyond shone in their tubs. The hall's candles burned true, their flames steady in air that had learned to be kind. Adrian lifted their joined hands and let the ribbon's ends fall like a small banner. "Walk with me," he said. They left the center and moved to the neighboring gallery where light gathered and people did not. The parquet drank the sound of their steps. Candles cast their two shadows into one long shape that slid along the wall like a quiet animal. Isabel could feel the heat of his skin through the ribbon and the thrum of blood under it. It was not a demand. It was an answer. He halted under a window, where rain blurred the garden to softness. "I thought honor was a cage," he said. "I find it is a door when the right hand opens it." "You opened it," she said. "I pushed. That is the whole story." He looked down at their joined wrists. "There is one more thing. If you say council would prefer we stage our happiness," she said, almost smiling, "I will stage nothing." "I was going to say," he replied, "that council can be made to applaud anything when the minister reads a seal aloud." "You have already learned too much," she said. "I had a teacher," he said. "She speaks softly and does not waste words." He reached with his free hand, and she let him touch the damp ends of her hair where the rain had caught them indoors from another life outdoors. Her eyes closed for the span of one breath, and opened again. The ribbon held. It did not chafe. It did not command. It reminded. He leaned toward her, not to claim, not to prove, but to share the small warmth that human beings exchange when they are permitted at last to be honest. She lifted her face the fraction that made the gesture mutual. Their foreheads met. A simple seal. The contact was chaste and more intimate than anything else they could have done in public. "There will be pamphlets," she said, "because humor keeps courage from turning into stone." "Let them write," he said. "We have our letter." "Guard it," she said. "I will," he answered, and in the way he said it lived 1,000 unspoken daily promises. To be patient, to be attentive, to be exact in affection as in duty. They turned once, a slow step and a second, hands bound, the ribbon brushing his sleeve and her skin. Music wandered in from the chapel like a memory of what nearly was. It offered them an easy rhythm. They took it. The dance was no dance at all, only movement that anyone could have understood, if they had ever watched two people learn to stand content within the reach of each other's warmth. When they returned to the threshold of the Hall of Mirrors, the court had resumed its favorite activity, pretending to be indifferent when it was not. The minister waited with the register and a pen dried, ready to be used again when the future required it. Celeste stood with the guardsman out of reach of her mother's hand. Their words were careful, their smiles unguarded. The Duchess adjusted a ribbon on her own gown and managed, in the privacy of her mind, to forgive a fraction of what had been done to her orderly mourning. Marcel appeared at Adrien's shoulder, as if the ribbon on their wrists had summoned him. "The Comte is finding the provinces agreeable," he said in a tone that kept comedy from becoming cruelty. "The rain helps." "You have earned a day without tasks," Adrien said. "I am not built for idleness," Marcel replied. "I am built for precise chores that look like luck." "Then take one more," Isabel said, and slipped him the folded confession Celeste had written. "This belongs with the truth. Give it to the minister. Let it be kept but never read aloud." Marcel weighed the paper in his hand and understood the request's full delicacy. "As you wish," he said. "Some words save more people when they are folded." He withdrew. The minister accepted the note without curiosity. He had learned long ago that not all documents want light. Adrien looked at the blue ribbon. "Shall we leave it where it is?" he asked. "For today," Isabel said. "Tomorrow we will find other ways to be bound." "By arguments?" he suggested. "By laughter," she countered. He smiled then, and the smile reached his eyes and did not die there. It crossed the distance and entered hers and altered the shape of the day. They stood together in the long light while rain traced its delicate script on the windows. The orange blossom scent drifted in a warm breath from the orangerie. The mirrors held the image of their joined hands and would hold it longer than any gossip. The court muttered and mended its stories around them. The minister set his seal where it belonged and was satisfied with the economy of truth. The priest found his voice again and began to hum an old hymn that always sounded better on mornings that had nearly gone wrong. Isabel leaned a little closer, just enough that her shoulder brushed his arm through the silk. The ribbon lay easy against their skin. He looked at her, and the look said everything a vow could not carry without help. That whatever work came next would be done together, and that together was not a burden here, but a privilege earned. The rain softened. The air brightened. Somewhere in the vast house, a clock remembered to strike, and the tone rolled down the corridors like a benediction that had waited for the right moment. Their joined hands lifted a fraction, then settled, the blue knot neat and certain as a promise kept. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you liked the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.